session. It's going to deal with applying OIE import risk analysis framework to facilitate safe trade. I will call on Noel Murray, my brother from Canada, who is going to do an introduction to the OIE's risk analysis framework, which was supposed to follow an overview SPS agreement and obligation for member countries, that presentation I did last week. And so I take pleasure to invite Noel to carry on the presentation from here. Over to you, Noel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas. I'll see if I have any luck in sharing my screen. Right. Try and share that. Hopefully everyone can see that. All right, yeah. That's working okay?
It's fine.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, we can see it.
That's good. Okay, so today we've got 3 sessions. I'm going to talk about the first one, an introduction to the OIE's risk analysis framework, and then Tim will lead a discussion on a presentation on identifying and describing risk pathways for the entry, exposure and consequence assessment that I'll introduce in this session. And then finally, we'll look at identifying and selecting and implementing sanitary measures to effectively mitigate risk. So we've had quite a, excuse me, quite a lot of discussion already, or really good presentations setting the scene, if you like, that brings us to risk analysis, where we can hopefully try and bring the various elements of the different sessions that we've experienced until now together in helping us to navigate a path forward. Okay, so we'll just look here. The objectives of this session. I'd like to develop a greater appreciation of what's meant by risk and how we characterize risk. Importantly, dealing with incomplete information, the inevitable uncertainties that we face, the importance of adequately scoping a risk analysis, and that'll lead us into looking at the OIE's risk analysis framework and the role that that plays in facilitating safe international trade. And then finally, some comments on how we might achieve objectivity through transparency and peer review. Okay, so why would we undertake an import risk analysis? One thing I'd like to say, I know the focus of this is on import risk analysis, but it's really about a risk analysis aimed at facilitating safe international trade. And it may well be that, I think this OIE framework is sufficiently flexible that we can apply it not only at the international level, but we can apply it within a country as well. And we've seen examples in the last session of compartmentalization. So, risk analysis certainly has a very important role to play when one is defining a compartment and identifying the various risk factors and mitigating measures that one might apply to maintaining the status of a compartment. So essentially, we just want to think really broadly about this, and we can also apply this framework to exports as well to maybe facilitate the assurances that we're able to provide to trading partners, where we focus on one element of the overall framework. So it certainly helps us to identify and examine the risks associated with trade, whether that, as I say, be national or international, and it allows us to develop conditions that allow trade to proceed safely. And we have guidance for that provided by the OIE itself in both the terrestrial and aquatic animal health codes in chapters 2.1 of each of those codes. There's also an important resource, the Handbook on Import Risk Analysis for Animals and Animal Products. There's a 2-volume set. The first one is relevant to the discussion we're going to have today, and it's looking at an introduction and a qualitative risk analysis. This was the 2nd edition, released in 2010. This was initially published by the OIE in 2004 and updated in 2010. I've made that available for everyone as a PDF, and I noticed Patrick has already included a link to that in the chat. So it's probably a resource that's worth looking at. And there's also the World Trade Organization agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures, the so-called WTO SPS agreement that Thomas introduced last week. So basically, risk analysis is a structured way of thinking that provides us with a framework for identifying, assessing, and managing risks in terms of what can go wrong, how likely it might be that something goes wrong, and how serious it would be if it actually went wrong. And then what can we do to reduce the likelihood and or the seriousness of something going wrong? So essentially, risk is a function of both probability and magnitude. So probability, also think of that in terms of expressing it as chances or likelihood of something happening, such as a disease outbreak. And then what are the likely magnitude of the consequences? And that could be the scale of an outbreak and the associated costs of control and or eradication. We can also think about trade losses. There may be sociological and ecological impacts, etc. So when communicating about risk, one important element that we need to appreciate is how it may actually be perceived. And perception is influenced by many factors, such as the beliefs, attitudes, judgments, and feelings of individuals, whether the risk is seen as being voluntary, involuntary, individually controlled, maybe it's familiar, is it seen as being fairly distributed, is it memorable, is it natural, or is it seen as being catastrophic? So basically, perception determines how upsetting a risk might actually be. So a really important element of risk analysis and the work that we're doing is how a risk is perceived does not justify the imposition of measures to manage political expectations or perhaps to appease stakeholder concerns. And there are certainly many examples of trade disputes that arise as a result of attempts to manage perception. And these measures that are implemented based on perception basically fail to respect international standards or obligations. They're inevitably arbitrary and end up being discriminatory, and they're certainly likely to be disproportionate to the likely level of risk. Now, an example of that might be back in 2003, Canada discovered BSE or mad cow disease in a native-born animal in Canada, and immediately many countries ceased trade in beef and beef products with Canada. There was a gradual restoration of trade, and some countries like South Korea, for example, maintained a prohibition for many years. And that was really driven by perception. There was a lot of fear about mad cow disease, I guess, in the public domain. A lot of political pressure to prohibit or ban Canadian beef. But unfortunately, you know, that wasn't supported by a transparently documented risk assessment. There were already measures within the OIE code that would enable the safe trade of beef and beef products from BSE affected countries. So you can see with that example that, you know, the country that implements measures to manage perception fails to respect international obligations and standards. And you know, a prohibition obviously is the most strict form of sanction one can have or risk mitigation measure one can have in terms of attempting to manage risk, but it's really disproportionate to the likely level, given that there are measures in place that countries can implement to assure the sanitary safety of the commodity of concern. So an important obligation under the SPS agreement is that there should be no restrictions or sanitary measures, if you like, on international trade in animals and animal products, unless it's likely, unless there's a legitimate reason that a disease may enter, establish, or spread and lead to unacceptable consequences, whether they be biological or economic. So for the purpose of international trade, it's essential to evaluate risk as a function of both the probability of something happening and the likely magnitude of its consequences, not perception. So risk analysis provides us with a tool to deal with incomplete information, the inevitable uncertainties that we all face. Such as the prevalence of disease, whether the pathogen that we're looking at survives various processing methods such as freezing or maybe pH changes or cooking. And it's essentially a structured process that helps us in our decision making in the face of the inevitable uncertainties that we face. So what's the difference between uncertainty and variability? This is important because I think a lot of people do mix these concepts up, if you like. So basically, uncertainty reflects a lack of understanding or incomplete knowledge of a particular system, whereas variability is the inevitable or the natural heterogeneity that exists within any biological system. So we can reduce uncertainty as our knowledge increases, and obviously variability remains a constant. So it's just important to differentiate between those two concepts. So risk analysis itself is a little bit like building a jigsaw puzzle. There are lots of disparate pieces of information that we need to bring together to evaluate the overall situation. And it could turn out that while there's considerable uncertainty at one point in our risk pathway, its overall contribution to the final risk estimate is actually inconsequential. So in such circumstances, it's important not to overemphasize the uncertainty that exists, but we need to provide the appropriate perspective, and that's where risk analysis is really useful. So let's look at an example. Suppose we want to estimate the likelihood of an outbreak of foot and mouth disease associated with importing goat's cheese. So for this scenario to unfold, there's a few steps that must be in place. There must be an outbreak of FMD in the exporting country that results in at least one goat shedding FMD virus in the milk. The virus must survive the pasteurization process, the cheese manufacturing, storage and transportation. And then a susceptible animal must ingest discarded cheese, become infected, and pass it on to other animals in the importing country. So what sort of information might we have available? Well, let's suppose there's very good information on the survival of the virus in pasteurized milk. There's limited information on the occurrence of FMD in the exporting country. And perhaps there's virtually no information on the likelihood of susceptible animals ingesting cheese scraps in the importing country. So in that situation, we conclude there's a significant amount of uncertainty on the occurrence of FMD in the exporting country, as well as the exposure of susceptible animals in the importing country. So what can we do? So we need to consider the impact of these uncertainties on the overall risk estimate. So if pasteurization is known to effectively kill FMD virus, the impact of these other uncertainties is actually insignificant. However, if there's significant variability in the efficacy of pasteurization, there may be heat-tolerant strains of FMD virus, those uncertainties become much more important. So we can see already we're able to start beginning to characterize the uncertainties that exist and their potential impact on our final risk estimate, depending on the scenario. So where there's significant uncertainty, we may adopt a precautionary approach. However, the measures that we do end up selecting must still be based on some sort of rational assessment of risk that takes account of the available scientific information. And those measures should be reviewed as soon as additional information becomes available and be consistent with other measures where equivalent levels of uncertainty exist. So it's not acceptable basically to conclude that because there's significant uncertainty, measures will be based on a precautionary approach. There's got to be a rational relationship between the measures that are selected. They must be made apparent, be transparently documented. So before we embark on a risk analysis, it's important or essential actually that the risk assessors and risk managers, as well as other stakeholders, have a clear understanding right from the very beginning of what the questions are that are being posed, as well as the purpose and scope of the analysis. So we could ask ourselves whether the following request, if you like, provides sufficient background and scope to embark on a risk analysis. So what's the question might be, what's the risk of importing sheep or goat meat? And this is the sort of questions that I've seen in the past. And, you know, the risk assessor may go away and do a whole lot of work, only to come back and have a discussion with the risk manager or whoever put in the request to find that, well, they didn't really hit the mark. It wasn't really exactly what was the risk manager might have had in mind. So there's important elements here. What else would we like to know? What's the nature of the meat? Is it raw, unprocessed, frozen, chilled, cooked, etc.? These are important elements associated with the commodity. So in terms of scoping itself, it's really important that it's an iterative process and involves at least the risk manager and the risk assessor. So if a request is vague or ill-defined and poorly thought through, it will inevitably lead to a report that no one's actually satisfied with. So we shouldn't really embark on a risk analysis until all involved agree on the scope and the purpose of the analysis. So in determining the scope, it requires that we define as precisely as possible the animals or animal products which are the subject of the analysis. And importantly, the nature, the sources, including the country of origin and the intended uses in the importing country. What are the scientific names? We need to use those when describing animal species or disease agents, so we have a clear understanding. And then perhaps what are the relevant methods of production, manufacturing, processing or testing normally applied? And they could include quality assurance programs such as HACCP. And there are various options for scoping and analysis. We may focus on a particular commodity such as chicken meat, a single animal species such as pigs, or maybe a group of similar species, for example, ruminants, a particular disease, or maybe a group of diseases with similar epidemiological characteristics such as orbiviruses. We may focus on a particular country. It could be a bilateral risk analysis, or maybe it's a multilateral analysis looking at a particular trading bloc such as the European Union, or perhaps it's looking at any country. In other words, the so-called generic risk analysis. So, excuse me. So it's important to state the purpose clearly. So for example, we could characterize it like this: to identify and assess the likelihood of the hazards or pathogens of interest, if you like, being introduced and spreading or becoming established in your country, together with the likelihood of and the likely magnitude of their potential consequences for either animal or human health, if it's a zoonotic disease we're looking at, as a result of importing the commodity for a particular end use. And then to recommend sanitary measures if appropriate. It's not always that sanitary measures will be necessarily applied. It depends on the situation. Sanitary measures are not necessarily inevitable. But the sanitary measures that we end up recommending are based on an evaluation of the attendant risks. So let's look at an example. A request has been received, just building on our question before, a request to import sheep and goat meat from countries where Pestidipidi rumina is endemic. So it's important, as I said, to use scientific names when describing the animal species or disease agents, as we can see here, and then describe the nature, the intended uses and sources of the commodity. So for example, we might be looking at chilled or frozen sheep meat or goat meat for human consumption from a country where PPR is endemic. So that should provide us with a very clear understanding of the nature of the analysis. It's important also to describe the relevant methods of production, manufacturing, processing or testing that are normally applied. These are part of our commodity definition, if you like. That would include processes such as chilling, freezing, cooking, curing, or perhaps irradiation. And it's important to describe quality assurance programs that may be applied and how they're actually verified. So for example, HACCP programs for the production of pig meat. And then we may want to try and estimate the likely annual volume of trade. And that may be somewhat difficult. It may not be readily available, particularly if trade is new. So here's an example. We're looking at assessing the likelihood of PPR virus, and with the scientific name, spreading or becoming established in your country and its likely consequences as a result of importing chilled or frozen meat for human consumption derived from domestically reared sheep and goats in a country where PPRV is endemic, and then to recommend sanitary measures if appropriate. We might want to draft a suitable title for our analysis. And that could be, in this case, chilled or frozen sheep goat meat from a country or zone where PPRV is endemic. Oops. Okay, so we're now going to turn our attention to the framework provided by the OIE for risk analysis. So it's basically 4 broad elements: hazard identification, risk assessment, and risk management. And then underpinning each of these different elements is risk communication. So the principal aim of the framework is essentially to assess the disease risks objectively and transparently to ensure the sanitary safety of trade in animals and animal products, whether they're of terrestrial or aquatic origin. And then to ensure that the sanitary measures that end up being applied are justified and actually appropriate to the circumstances. So the best outcome from the analysis reduces risk to an acceptable level, obviously. It's important that we want to avoid disputes or disagreements. We want to minimize the measures that are actually required to effectively manage risk. We don't want to over-manage the risk pathway. There may well be a temptation to do that. For example, to apply measures at multiple points in the pathway, but risk analysis provides us with the tool to enable us to gain perspective about the extent of the measures that are needed to effectively manage the risk. We may not resolve all differences with stakeholders, but hopefully it leads to a better understanding of the rationale that has led us to a particular decision. So let's start first with risk communication, just a few comments on that. So the OIE's definition of risk communication is a process involving an open, interactive, iterative, and transparent exchange of information on hazards and their associated risks, together with proposed mitigation measures. So risk communication itself involves an exchange of information and opinions regarding hazards and risks, the results and conclusions of the risk analysis, as well as the proposed measures. And that exchange occurs amongst potentially affected and interested stakeholders, such as the authorities in the exporting country, domestic consumers, livestock producers, as well as the SPS committee. And Thomas talked last week about our notification obligations associated with the SPS agreement. The communication strategy ideally should be established at the start of each risk analysis and continue throughout the process. So that's just a snapshot overview, if you like, of risk communication. Let's look at the next step now, hazard identification. And this is really the essential first step in the risk analysis, where we identify pathogens that may potentially produce adverse biological, environmental, or economic consequences. So the consequences associated with the pathogens are obviously quite broad. And importantly, that they're known to affect the animals being imported or from which the commodity is derived. And basically, if you don't identify a hazard, you can't assess or manage it. I was talking just before we started the formal session this morning about a pathogen. This is a plant pathogen, if you like, that was introduced into North America some years ago, emerald ash borer, and it's actually devastating the ash trees in North America. There are billions of trees that have died. And basically the emerald ash borer was introduced on wooden pallets, imported with various commodities loaded onto pallets that came from China. And it just was a risk pathway that wasn't even thought about. It was an absolute failure of the hazard identification process. And as a consequence, you know, that plant pest, if you like, a forest pest was introduced, and it's completely devastating. So it's important to draw up a comprehensive list of all the pathogens associated with the commodity that we're investigating. And then we can start with the diseases listed by the OIE and add others as appropriate. It may be important to consult with stakeholders as necessary to help to refine our list of potential pathogens. Now, some categories of pathogenic agents may be excluded from consideration. That depends on the nature of the commodity or perhaps the methods of production, manufacturing, or processing. So, for example, obviously, gastrointestinal parasites are not relevant for semen or embryos. And arboviruses such as blue tongue virus transmitted by Culicoides midges or vectors don't need to be considered for meat and meat products. That may sound obvious, but I've certainly seen some risk analyses where they have been concerned about blue tongue virus being transmitted through meat and meat products. It's just not a biologically plausible pathway. And then, of course, highly processed commodities such as gelatin are not likely to be contaminated with various bacteria or viruses. Whatever the reason is for excluding the pathogen, it's important to document the rationale for doing so. Now, just a comment about safe commodities. So some disease-specific chapters in the code list commodities that have been determined to be safe for international trade. And this is in both the terrestrial and aquatic animal health codes, actually. So for those commodities, specific measures should not be required regardless of the status of the exporting country. So for example, if we look at chapter 8.1 to do with Mycobacterium and tuberculosis, safe commodities would consist of fresh meat and meat products from animals subjected to ante and post-mortem inspection. Other commodities, cured hides, skins and trophies, as well as gelatin, collagen, etc. These commodities should not require any specific mitigating measures to be applied because the commodity in and of itself, through the normal methods of production and processing, are safe. So, hazard identification. So the question we can ask ourselves, is the commodity under consideration a potential vehicle for the pathogen? Is it likely to contain or be contaminated with the pathogen of interest? So this is where we would need to assess the relevant epidemiology as well as the methods of production, manufacturing, and processing that are normally applied to determine if that commodity is potentially capable of harboring the pathogen. And then we could ask ourselves a couple of other questions. Is it likely to be exotic to your country or region? Is it likely to be present in the exporting country or region? We could also, if we're looking at compartments as well, consider those questions. Is the competent authority or the veterinary service of either country able to satisfactorily substantiate claims regarding the status of the pathogen? So the likelihood of these pathogenic agents being present or absent from the animal population of a country, or perhaps subpopulations where relevant, is assessed through an evaluation of the quality of the veterinary service, identification and traceability of animals and animal products, the existence of surveillance and monitoring programs, whether there's any official disease control programs in place, or whether zones or compartments have been defined. Oops, sorry, let's go back. So these are important questions we need to ask ourselves. If the pathogen is present in your country or region, or it shouldn't be considered any further, actually, unless it's subject to some sort of official control program. And that's an important discipline. Also, if there are zones or compartments of different animal health status, that's legitimate. You can certainly consider the pathogen in that case, but unless that's the case, then it doesn't, it's not justified to consider it any further because it's not subject to any official control. An important consideration too that would justify inclusion is if the local strains are likely to be less virulent than those reported in the exporting country. So in summary, if the commodity is a potential vehicle, it's likely to contain or be contaminated with the pathogen of interest. It's also likely to be present in the exporting country. It's perhaps it's exotic to your country, or it's present in your country, but it's subject to some sort of official control, or there are zones or compartments of different animal health status, or more virulent strains are reported in the exporting country than what exists in the importing country. Provided we can satisfy these different questions, if you like, we can classify the pathogen as a hazard. And once again, it's important to transparently document the rationale for the conclusions that we reach. Now, the next step, once we've identified our hazards, is to look at the code and to determine whether it provides any sanitary measures for that particular hazard in the commodity that we're considering. And if so, if that's the case, then we would apply the relevant measures. This, of course, is the preferred course of action unless perhaps domestic legislation, policy, or other considerations require a more complete analysis to be undertaken. And at this stage, an analysis may be concluded if we haven't actually identified any hazards, or if the measures recommended in the code are applied to each of the hazards that we've identified. Excuse me, I'm sorry about the coughing. It's a very dry environment at the moment. Our humidity is super low, probably about 20%. So it's really stirring my throat up. Okay, so let's turn our attention now to the next step in the framework, and that's looking at risk assessment. This is where we evaluate the likelihood and biological, environmental, or economic consequences associated with the entry, establishment, or spread of the hazard. So the commodity under consideration, it's important that we evaluate that in the form which it's intended to be used, processed, or sold. So there are 4 elements or 4 interrelated steps in our risk assessment. Entry assessment, followed by exposure assessment and consequence assessment, which are then the results of these different assessments here are brought together to enable us to provide an overall summary of the risk in our risk estimation step. So looking firstly at the entry assessment, this is where we're describing the biological or risk pathways, if you like, necessary for a commodity to become infected or contaminated with the hazard when imported at the time of importation. And we want to estimate what are the chances or likelihood of that occurring. And we can see here the focus of the entry assessment is at the time of exportation from the exporting country to the importing country. So what's the likelihood that the commodity at the time of export is contaminated or contains the hazard of interest? So the likelihood of it, this happening is influenced obviously by many factors, including the disease distribution or status of the exporting country, the susceptibility of the animals, and the impact of any disease control programs on the health status of the animals from which the commodity is derived. We need to consider the relevant production, manufacturing, and processing methods, as well as storage and transportation. How do these all impact on the survival of the hazard? And then, as well as the quality of the veterinary service or the competent authority. And this becomes important in providing us with confidence about the level of oversight that they're able to provide in looking at the disease status of the country and any assurances that may come with certification once, if and when we need to apply some sanitary measures. And at this stage, the risk assessment may be concluded if the likelihood of introducing the hazard is negligible. The important thing about undertaking a risk analysis is that we only do it to the extent that's necessary. If at any point during the analysis we conclude that that step, the likelihood associated with that particular step is negligible, then there's no reason to continue with the analysis. So for the exposure assessment, now we're looking at describing the biological or risk pathways necessary for either animals or humans to be exposed to a hazard and to estimate the likelihood of those exposures occurring. So it's important to think under the OIE framework, exposure to a hazard and the outcome from that exposure are actually two different steps. So whether or not susceptible animals or humans actually become infected as a result of being exposed depends on a range of factors. We can think about the route of exposure, how susceptible the host is, what's the level of exposure, what's the dose, and what's the likely response of the host. But basically, that outcome, if you like, is actually the consequence of exposure. So the likelihood of one or more susceptible animals or humans becoming infected and then subsequent spread, etc., is really considered in the consequence assessment step. In the exposure assessment, we want to identify susceptible animal species or humans if it's a zoonotic disease, and to estimate the likelihood of those susceptible animals or humans becoming exposed to the hazard of interest, not the outcome of that exposure. So the likelihood of being exposed is influenced by many factors. Won't necessarily go through all these now, but you've got a bit of a checklist there, just as a reminder of the many factors we need to take into account in undertaking the exposure assessment. Obviously, intended end uses of the imported commodity, the relevant production methods, etc. Importantly, looking at waste or effluent disposal may be relevant, depending on the nature of the commodity. The susceptibility of animals or humans, any intermediate hosts or vectors that may exist. Importantly, we may need to consider human or animal demographics, as well as farming practices, etc. So once again, if we conclude that the likelihood of exposure at every exposure pathway is negligible, we can conclude our risk assessment. And then the next step, it's a consequence assessment, where now we're looking at identifying the consequences, whether they be biological, environmental, or economic, that are associated with the entry, establishment, or spread of the hazard. And we want to estimate the likely magnitude of those consequences, as well as the likelihood of them actually occurring. It's important that there be a causal relationship between exposure to a hazard and an adverse effect. So this is an important discipline, actually. Only those consequences directly or indirectly attributable to the hazard should be taken into account. So any positive or negative effects not related to the hazard do not fall within the scope of an animal health import risk analysis. And we can think of examples there, such as the benefit for consumers through the importation of cheaper goods. This is not a disease-associated effect, if you like. And what are the impacts of those goods on competitiveness of a particular industry? Unless there's a direct link with the pathogen, the consequences such as these should not be considered in the animal health risk analysis. And there may well need to be some sort of consideration elsewhere, but it certainly doesn't fall under the scope of a risk analysis. It falls outside the scope of the SPS agreement as well. If we remember before, essentially the SPS agreement is talking about the concept of free trade, where there should be no restrictions on trade unless there's a justifiable and legitimate health concern. So potential consequences themselves can be quite broad. We can look at the impacts if it's a zoonotic disease on human health, obviously animal health and welfare. There could well be consequences directly associated with the a hazard at the social or psychological level. There may be environmental or ecological impacts as well, even economic or political, and maybe threats to national security. And we'll just look at some examples of that in a moment. So factors to consider: what's the likelihood of one or more susceptible animals and or humans actually becoming infected, and what are the subsequent outcomes of that infection? And there's a range of factors that we need to take into account there. So we may need to pay attention to economic considerations. What are the likely costs of control or eradication? Compensation in association with the disease outbreak. Are there any ongoing surveillance or monitoring costs if the hazard was introduced and started to spread or become established? Any costs associated with biosecurity services? What about changes in consumer demands and effects on related industries directly associated with the disease outbreak? There could well be trade losses. So these are legitimate economic considerations to take into account. They're directly associated with the hazard of interest, if there's some sort of level of spread or establishment. There may well be social or psychological effects on mental health or unemployment. Certainly when Canada had an outbreak of BSE back in 2003, it led to enormous social disruption and psychological impacts in the affected farming communities, and flow-on effects into some of the retailers that were supplying farms. There was a complete collapse of markets and loss of income for many people in the beef sector. And once again, an example there at the political level, the crisis in the European Union in 2000 associated with BSE. At a national security level, maybe there's potential to destabilize society through threats to the food supply or perhaps public health. So these are all legitimate factors to consider in our consequence assessment. So just looking at a couple of examples here, we're just looking at BSE or mad cow disease, foot and mouth disease, and highly pathogenic avian influenza. So in terms of human health consequences, obviously with BSE, there's new variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. There are no human health implications associated with foot and mouth disease. And for HPAI, it's going to depend on the strain. In terms of animal welfare for BSE, there's really no general animal welfare considerations. It's really not a, if it wasn't a zoonotic disease, if you like, then I don't think we'd be really concerned about it, because at a population level, within the cattle population, it really does have minimal impact. For FMD and HPAI, there may be certainly concerns or associated with mass culling, overcrowding stress, etc., in terms of animal welfare in how the outbreak is dealt with. Animal health, as I said before, for BSE, limited impact at a population level. Obviously for FMD and HPAI, there could be large-scale outbreaks with significant morbidity and mortality. Perhaps we need to consider social and psychological impacts. We've already indicated that individual community stress may be important. Things like anxieties, depression, maybe shame or stigma of families and communities, and perhaps leading to significant unemployment if there are actually collapses of a particular industry. It can really be quite disruptive to a society. Are there any environmental or ecological impacts? For BSE, you might be concerned about spillover into wild populations, wildlife, such as deer. For FMD and HPAI, maybe we need to look at the impacts associated with large-scale slaughter or mass burial, or perhaps burning, leading to contamination of air, water, and soil. Economic consequences, we've talked already about collapse of markets, loss of markets. There's also, of course, the costs associated with control, eradication, and production losses. At the political level, there may be some consequences associated with the loss of confidence in the government. It may be a consequence of an outbreak of a particular disease. At the national security level, we can think about threats to the food supply, not an issue for BSE, but with foot and mouth disease or maybe with HPII. What about significant human-to-human transmission with a high case fatality rate? Obviously, that would depend on the strain. If a highly virulent strain emerged that was capable of transmission within the human population, that might be a real concern as well. So in identifying potential outbreak scenarios, there are a number of different levels that we would look at. Does it, we could think about whether the disease spreads within the exposed population. Does it spread within an exposed population, but it's quickly identified and eradicated? Perhaps it becomes established and spreads to other populations before being eventually eradicated. Or perhaps it spreads to other populations and actually becomes endemic. So a number of different levels to consider. And then we need to estimate the likelihood of each one of these outbreak scenarios. What's the likely magnitude of the associated consequences at various levels, whether that's at the farm or village level, perhaps the district, regional, provincial or state level, or maybe even at the national or country level. So once again, we can conclude our risk assessment if either no consequences are identified or the likelihood of each one is considered to be negligible. In that case, it's reasonable to conclude the analysis. Okay, so let's look now at the risk estimation step. This is where we bring the results from the entry, exposure and consequence assessments together. And this really is a prerequisite step to risk management. And that's where we'll talk about that later this morning or this afternoon. And that's the step that enables us to determine whether or not sanitary measures, what the type of sanitary measures that we may need to implement. So it's not sufficient to conclude there's a possibility of a hazard entering and susceptible animals and or humans being exposed and potential consequences arising. We can't focus on possibility. We must provide context through an evaluation of the likelihood of each one of those. So for the entry assessment, we could ask, is the likelihood that the commodity is carrying the hazard when it's imported negligible? If yes, then the risk estimate is classified as negligible. If not, then we need to look at the exposure assessment. So for the exposure assessment, what's the likelihood of susceptible animals or humans being exposed by each and every exposure pathway? Is that negligible? If yes, then the overall risk estimate is classified as negligible. If not, we need to look at the consequence assessment, the outcome from the consequence assessment step. So once again, is the likelihood of each and every significant consequence negligible? If yes, the risk estimate is classified as negligible. If not, then the risk is estimated to be non-negligible and we proceed to risk management, which we'll talk about later today. Okay, just a brief introduction on risk management. And basically, this is the process of identifying, selecting, and implementing measures to effectively mitigate the risk. And it's really not acceptable to simply identify a range of measures that might reduce the risk. It's important that there be a rational relationship between the measures that we choose and the risk assessment. So the results of the risk assessment actually support the measure. This is a really important discipline under both the OIE framework as well as the SPS agreement, that there has to be this rational relationship. The measure is informed by the risk management measure, if you like, is informed by the risk assessment that we've undertaken. So in terms of sanitary measures themselves, it's important that they be technically, operationally, and economically feasible. We implement the measures to the extent that it's reasonably necessary to protect human or animal health. We don't want to overmanage the risk pathway. There may be a natural temptation at times to do that, but through risk assessment, we're able to identify those particular points in the pathway where it's reasonable to intervene. It's important that the measures be consistent with our obligations as members of both the World Trade Organization as well as the OIE. It's important also that the measures be applied consistently across a range of commodities likely to contain the same or similar hazards to avoid situations where different levels of protection arise. Now, an example of that might be some years ago, Australia imposed a ban on importing wild-caught Pacific salmon from Canada, and because of concern about a particular disease, Eromonas salmonacida. And it turned out that that wasn't consistent across a range of commodities likely to contain the same or similar hazards, because Australia was allowing the importation of ornamental fish with no particular risk mitigation measures in place. So those ornamental fish may well have contained the hazard of interest. It wasn't that risk pathway, if you like, associated with ornamental fish wasn't being managed. There was an inconsistency with what Australia was doing in relation to prohibiting wild-caught Pacific salmon from Canada. And that issue was driven by concerns within an evolving industry sector in Australia, particularly in the southern states that were developing an Atlantic salmon industry. And they were concerned that imports of a potentially cheaper commodity would undercut their competitiveness. But that's obviously, as we talked about before, not a legitimate issue to be considered in an animal health import risk analysis. It's out of scope. So obviously, OIE standards are the preferred choice when we come to thinking of the measures to apply. And where they don't exist, or where the proposed measure actually results in a higher level of protection than that provided by the OIE, the measures must be supported by a risk assessment. So remember before we said earlier, following the hazard identification step, if there are measures in the code and we apply those measures, there may be no need to continue with the risk assessment. But just in wrapping up this session, I'd like to finish off by talking a little bit about how we achieve objectivity and looking at transparency and peer review. Now, obviously, a risk analysis inevitably includes a degree of subjectivity. The personal opinions and perceptions of the analysts, the experts that we may consult, as well as the decision makers themselves, these are all inescapable realities. So to ensure a reasonable level of objectivity is obtained, it's essential that the analysis is transparently documented as well as subject to peer review. So transparency itself, if it's done well, ensures fairness and rationality. We have a clear understanding of the decision-making process. It leads to consistency in decision-making. It facilitates the understanding by interested parties, or so-called stakeholders. It will ensure that the uncertainties, the inevitable uncertainties, are dealt with appropriately. It makes clear what are the reasons for the conclusions and recommendations, and that they are supported by a reasoned and logical discussion. And then finally, the interested parties or the stakeholders are provided with clear reasons for the imposition of measures, or depending on the situation, there may actually be no requirement for a particular measure. So what does transparency involve? A comprehensive documentation of all the data and information in our analysis, as well as, importantly, the assumptions and the uncertainties. It's quite surprising at times how assumptions and uncertainties are glossed over in some risk analyses that are undertaken. But it's really important to document all your assumptions and to clearly explain the attendant uncertainties if and where they exist, and how they may influence the final outcome. The methods that are employed in the risk analysis, obviously the results, as well as the discussion and conclusions. And it's important that the analysis be supported by relevant references from the scientific literature. So in terms of peer review, this is going to help ensure that the analysis is technically robust. So the data, the information that we're tapping into, the methods and the assumptions, the peer review process will ensure that they're the best available. And importantly, that a reasonable level of objectivity has been obtained. It also ensures that the measures are both appropriate to the circumstances and consistent with our obligations, whether they be domestic or international. So peer review basically is a scientific critique, if you like, of the analysis. And that could occur at multiple levels. It may be within the veterinary service or the competent authority itself. It could be externally through selected experts with specialized knowledge. We may employ or enlist external experts, if you like, in undertaking a peer review of our work. Basically, a peer review can only be carried out properly when reviewers have a clear understanding of what's expected of them. And certainly in work that I've done in the past, terms of reference are essential. If we just ask somebody to, could you have a look at this and see if it's all right? Is that good enough? I mean, maybe if people are obviously very busy with many things on their plate. And unless you give them specific guidance, I'd like you, to look at a particular element of this risk analysis or whatever, depending on their expertise. The feedback that you get may be, well, yeah, I had a look and it seemed all right, but have you got confidence that they truly engaged and are providing substantive feedback? The comments themselves should be incorporated where appropriate into the analysis. If not, the rationale for rejecting them should be documented. So finally, this is just a flow chart of the risk analysis process within the OIE. And this is taken from the handbook that I made reference to earlier on import risk analysis for animals and animal products. So we can see here, the project is initiated. There may be a market access request from a potential importer or trading partner. We talked about scoping the analysis and developing communication strategy. Important that everyone from the very beginning has a clear understanding of the purpose and scope of the analysis. Then we work through our process where we identify hazards associated with the commodity, asking ourselves whether there are any measures within the code to mitigate risks for those hazards, and if so, we can apply those. Then we conduct the risk assessment itself, where OE measures don't exist, perhaps. And we're going to talk in the next session, Tim's going to lead the discussion there, on drawing scenario trees to map out risk pathways to help in our risk assessment steps. And we work through that, and then we finally come, looking at the entry and exposure assessment, consequence assessment, come to an overall conclusion in our risk estimation step. If it's greater than negligible, then we can explore sanitary options to effectively mitigate risk. At some point, it's important to undertake a peer review to ensure that the measures are appropriate, that we've achieved a reasonable level of objectivity, and the results are consistent with our international obligations. And on we go. So we can see over here on the right-hand side that there's various points here where it would be appropriate to communicate with stakeholders, whether they be within the country or maybe with trading partners, or perhaps even the World Trade Organization through the SPS committee. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to Thomas. if there's any questions at this stage.
Thank you, Noel, for that highly informative and transfer of knowledge to all of us who are participating in this workshop today. In the chat box, you have a chance to ask a question, but you can also raise your hand. On the reactions, you pick raise hand or lower hand if you have finished to ask your question. And Noel has given you that privilege to ask a question. And also, I just wanted to mention in the chat box, there are some documents which have been put in the chat box, PDF, for the guidelines, the OIE guidelines for the risk, the OIE import risk analysis framework guidelines, which Noel has based his presentation from. And so if there are any questions, it's time you can unmute your microphone and say, we want to hear your voices also. Over. Where silence means, I give it back to Noel so that they can continue. Maybe the questions are coming here. Over to you, Noel.
Thank you, Thomas. Okay, so if there's no questions at this stage, we'll come back and we'll have an opportunity after today's sessions to have a broader discussion, if you like, on risk analysis. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Tim to lead us through the next section. Thanks, Tim.
Okay, thank you, Noel. And let me share the screen here. Are we sharing? I take that as a no. Sharing okay?
Perfect.
Okay. So thank you, Noel, for the overview and introduction to risk analysis. And I'll be continuing that with, as Noel said, talking about a process known as scenario tree development. So the topic I'm going to be talking about is identifying and describing the risk pathways in a risk assessment. And is that coming up clearly? I believe so.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, okay,
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
So that, as I said, I'll be identifying and describing the risk pathways using scenario trees and doing that through the illustration of two examples. One is PRRS and the other is African horse sickness, or AHS virus. As Noel said, in doing a risk estimation, it's comprised of three components, three assessments: the entry, coming into a country, exposure, infecting or contaminating an individual or group in that population in the country, and ultimately, what is the impact? How much is it spread? And economically and environmentally, what is the impact? So that's what I'm going to be focusing on. So prior to doing this risk assessment, as Noel pointed out, we need to, first of all, identify the hazard. And for the two pathogens we talked about, they're PRRS and African horse sickness viruses, but also the animal species that's susceptible. Focus only on those and not on the entire population, because shortly the risk assessment becomes very unruly. So we're going to need to focus on, is it terrestrial animals only? Is it aquatic animals only? Are these wildlife we're dealing with? Are these domestic animals? Are these farm animals? Whatever might be of importance, that's what we limit our focus to. And also, are humans, is this a zoonotic disease or not? So I find one of the best ways to do this, keep in mind that doing a risk assessment can be very daunting. It can be very complicated, and before you know it, you forget what you're doing. It's very difficult to communicate to somebody unless you do this in an organized fashion. And I found that with doing risk assessments and doing epidemic modeling, one of the best ways to do this is lay out the problem in some sort of a map. With modeling, I would be doing a flow diagram. With risk assessment and with economic analyses, I would use something called scenario trees, or having different names being probability trees or decision trees in economics. So again, we need to identify the hazard and what commodities are infected for the entry when imported. And once imported into a country, what species, human and or animals, are we worried about that might be exposed? And once exposed, what's going to happen, how much spread might occur, and what's the consequence occurring for that? And as I said, one of the easiest ways to do this, one of the best ways to clearly communicate the scenario is through scenario trees. And this gives you a little idea of some of the benefits of doing this scenario tree approach. It's a graphical depiction, and it's a way for you to identify information that you're going to need for your risk assessment. It gives you an idea of the understanding of the problem. It allows you to focus on events that are occurring and making sure that you've captured all the events. And I think here, what we've learned over the last 4 weeks is when doing a risk analysis, it's not simply an individual sitting down and sitting at the computer and typing in probability information. It's much more based on the understanding of the system in its entirety. And we've seen this from the production process. We need to know, say, with the pigs, where do they go? What are the compartments they might be in? Geographically, where are the problems going to be? We've had a lot of really good information on ASF regarding that diagnostics and the virology of the virus. So it essentially takes a village to create a risk analysis. It's not just an analyst sitting in his or her office and doing this analysis by themselves. So again, laying out the scenario tree analysis, we can identify these sanitary measures that are important. And ultimately, we've got a scheme where we can go and conduct our risk analysis. Initially, we're going to be doing a qualitative risk analysis, which is the first step. And ultimately, you might take this and develop it into a quantitative model for a quantitative risk analysis. And as Noel has pointed out, communication is very important. And I think through the development and presentation of scenario trees and working with decision makers and clients and people that you're communicating with on one side or the other of the border that you're dealing with is a very efficient way to communicate a risk assessment. All right. We're going to be creating these pathways, and it's important to know that the pathways that you create must be plausible and not a hypothetical pathway that could occur, might occur if only something would happen. We're not interested in that. We're focusing on what is reasonable, what will happen, what's plausible. So in creating a scenario tree, there's a number of ways to do this. One is to start at the beginning. And to do that, we have an initiating event. And in creating a tree, you would be creating it from left to right and reading it from left to right. So we start off on the far left with an initiating event and end up on the far right with the outcome, the final endpoint or outcome of interest. And I've highlighted in red outcomes of interest that are important to the risk analysis. And in black, we'll have outcomes that are not going to be important to the consequence of the analysis. In the interim, you create steps that are going to either be actions or events occurring along the way to the endpoint. And in talking about the steps and creating the scenario tree, I think it's important to keep in mind that you want to keep this very simple. You can come up with 30 or 40 steps, and once you start inputting those, your scenario tree becomes very confusing. So if you can create a scenario tree that's very simple and capture the important elements, you're going to be doing a whole lot better in the end, better to understand, better to communicate. But as you develop it, you find, no, we're missing a step, we need to include this, then you can do that as necessary. So as we go from left to right, we have an initiating event, and we need to start connecting the events to the steps and including the probabilities of the event or step occurring. So with the qualitative risk analysis, we may not have probabilities at hand. We may instead be looking at something being highly likely, likely, unlikely, or negligible. So we may have degrees as opposed to precise probabilities. So we start off with an initiating event. It may be likely to occur or not. And if it doesn't occur, then we're satisfied. It's not going to occur. We can conclude this pathway, eliminate it. If it is, on the other hand, likely to occur, then we go to step one, and do something. And as the result of step one, if it's likely to occur, then we move on to step two. If it's not, then we conclude that branch. So again, step one, likely, go to step two, likely. And if step two creates an event that is likely, then our endpoint would be the outcome of interest. And we could focus on that for the next part of our risk assessment. So let's look at an example now that might be more familiar to you or should be more familiar to you. We're looking at the importation of an animal from an infected herd and looking at testing that animal and determining whether or not the individual should be, based on its test result, rejected or accepted. So let's assume that we have an animal from an infected herd, and we estimate, or we could project the likelihood of the animal to be infected. And you might know that information from background surveillance studies that you've done, looking at the prevalence of the disease in a population at a herd level. So if you were to select an infected herd, there is a probability that you will select an infected animal from that herd. And that would be based on your estimation of that likelihood would be based on the within herd prevalence and within herd incidence of that particular disease. So the animal could be infected based on the prevalence or not infected. In either case, step one would be, you would be testing the animal. It could either be, if it's infected, it would be positive or negative, and that would be dependent on the sensitivity of the test. If the animal is truly infected and tests positive, then you would truly or accurately reject that animal as being infected. So it'd be a good test on an infected animal. Or you could have a false negative test where the sensitivity is not perfect, and you may have an infected animal that you actually infect, or that you actually accept because the test was negative, even though the animal's infected. Or if the animal that you select is not infected and you test it based on the specificity of the test, you would have a proper negative result and correctly identifying the animal as being non-infected and accepted. Or you could have a false positive saying the animal, even though it's not infected, the test result might show it is infected, and in which case you would incorrectly reject the animal as being infected. All right, so that's the basic background of a scenario tree. Again, a simple tree, but you can see it's got a lot of information in there regarding prevalence of the disease problem, incidence of the disease problem, transmissibility that might be occurring. You can be looking at geographic information. You could be looking at the commodity chain and seeing what is going on to better inform yourself to identify information that you do need to collect. And it could be diagnostic information to complete the risk assessment. All right, let's move on to our first example with PRRS. And here we're going to be looking at an animal sent to slaughter, and it is not going to be intact. Instead, it's going to be processed and exported either in a chilled or frozen meat situation. So when we have the animal sent to slaughter, the animal could be either infected or not. If it's not infected and you chill the upcoming meat, the processed meat, then that meat will be chilled, frozen, and we're going to have no risk or a negligible risk, actually no risk, of that meat being contaminated. If, on the other hand, the animal is infected, it could be viremic. It may be long enough into the infection process that it's viremic, and there is therefore virus in the meat. Possibly on slaughter, if there is virus in the meat, you chill the meat. If you effectively chill or freeze the meat, then you will come up with an outcome where there is no viable virus in the meat product upon export. However, if you were to chill the meat and unsuccessfully kill the virus, you're left with a situation where you have virus in the imported chilled or frozen meat. And at that point, we would focus on this situation here and move on to our risk exposure. And we're going to be doing that in two parts. So we're at the situation where we exported meat that had the virus in it. The meat is now chilled or frozen, but it's come into the country. Now what happens in the country, the meat may be processed or not. If not processed, then it may go to a household or a restaurant, and the meat may be consumed at that point, or you may have the meat in such a situation that you have scraps of the meat that are not consumed and discarded, and those discarded scraps could be viremic and worth considering. Or you could process the meat. Again, you may or may not generate scraps prior to the processing. If you don't process the scraps, then they could go back into the same chain here and either end up being discarded and viremic, or no scraps, not discarded, and having no risk or not being contaminated. Or if you do have the scraps and they are not treated, then you would again have scraps in your population. So we take the scraps and focus on those in the next step. If the scraps are discarded, what's going to happen with them? They can be taken and just simply put out into a landfill, but they are accessible by wildlife. And as we've been talking about with ASF, if you have a landfill, you've got wild or feral pigs that could be exposed to that. And if your landfill is not fully protected, and there are not many that I have seen, you've got to consider the potential of exposure to your wildlife population and evaluate that subsequently as well. Or if the scraps are discarded and they're used in swill feeding, and I would assume most of the countries do still have swill feeding. In California, we have monitored swill feeding. So we have a limited number of stations in the state where swill feeding is protected, because the feeling is we'd rather keep it above board and people know what's going on and have it monitored. So if you do have swill feeding and don't cook it and feed it to pigs subsequently, you have the possibility of exposing a pig, at least one pig in a population or not, depending on if that swill is contaminated and the pig becomes infected or not. Now, if you're to cook the swill, it may, if done properly, inactivate the virus, in which case you are left with a situation where you're not going to be exposing a pig. But if the virus is not inactivated, there is a probability, a likelihood that you will infect at least one pig. So two situations where we could expose at least one pig is either through swill feeding that was improperly done, incompletely done, or if there's no swill feeding, no scraps, you could still likely infect a pig in your population. Okay, so with that, we have gone through the exposure and the introduction or spread into a population. And next, what we want to do is take a hierarchical look of how far that pathogen may spread in the population. So this tree here is essentially a hierarchical look at how far the virus could spread in the population. Either it stays on the farm, in the village, and goes nowhere else, that one pig is infected and it does not infect others. That's our scenario one. Or it goes up the pathway of infecting other pigs in the herd, other pigs in the village or local area, and then spread beyond into a region or district, and then even up to here, up to the national level, in which case you could have a very extensively spread problem at the national level, and the consequence would be extreme, versus if you were able to limit to the individual pig, or if it were spread to just a village or a herd, a single herd. So we're left with multiple different scenarios for our consequence analysis. Each of these would require more extensive, as they go up the ladder here, more extensive analyses and more extensive, more dire consequences. Okay, the second example I want to talk about is African horse sickness. And we're going to be focusing on this. It's as important because it's endemic to Southern Africa. And what I'd like to do here is go through, as Thomas and Noel have talked about, the OIE handbook on import risk analysis, volume 1. If you're more interested in this, you can follow up with the example I'm going to be talking about that is taken from that volume. So basically, we're looking at an orbivirus, and I've seen there are 1 to 10, and then I've seen there are 9 different serotypes. So we have multiple serotypes, let's say, of this virus. And the idea of this risk analysis was to have a focus on New Zealand, which has no African horse sickness, and to see what the risk would be if a domestic animal were exported from Southern Africa into New Zealand. Now, it's of interest to consider with all of this how that individual might be transported, if it would be transported via the air or via ship. I've done an import risk analysis for the state of California for infectious equine anemia, where we had animals coming in for racing, and some were shipped via the air and others were shipped via cargo containers or ships. And the importance there is the duration of time it takes to ship the animal. If shipped by air, it will arrive that day or the next day. If moved by ship, it could take a couple of weeks. And that's important with respect to the incubation period and the virus viremia that might be occurring within the animal. Okay, so we've gone through the hazard identification and identified the hazard as the African horse sickness virus. It's an OIE listed disease of equines, and it's not going to affect humans. It's not zoonotic. And we're focusing on the country being New Zealand, where it is exotic to that country. It's not been there ever identified. So let's take a look. Second step of the hazard identification is the epidemiology. It's important to know it's an infectious disease. It's not contagious. So if you commingle animals and you don't have a situation where you have the vector, the Chilocoides midge or gnat, as I would call it, is there, then you can have a group of animals with one infected and potentially not spreading in a contagious format to the other animals in the population. Okay, the domestic horse is an accidental host, and it can have a very high probability of being, the pathogen can be highly mortal with a 90–95% mortality rate, or the infected animal may have a mild viremia, mild fever affecting it. So importantly, as I talked about, is the viremia, and the viremia may last up to 21 days, and it may last for that period of time if the animal were naturally exposed, infected, or if the animal were vaccinated, and the vaccine, if it's an attenuated vaccine, if it reverts to virulence. So in either case, you may be looking at a potential exposure period from an infected animal that is viremic for up to 21 days. Once the viremia is passed, the animal is no longer going to be infectious. It's going to be have a state of sterile immunity. Okay, conclusion from the hazard identification. We're concerned about recently infected or mildly subclinically infected animals or vaccinated animals that can transmit African horse sickness virus to your population at risk. Therefore, the conclusion would be that AHS virus is classified as a hazard and should be considered further in this risk assessment. All right, and as Noel talked about the code, we need to look at that. The code does have sanitary measures for African horse sickness virus, but for the purposes of this study, we're going to assume that New Zealand has domestic legislation that requires a complete risk analysis of this problem, regardless of what we find in the early stages of the risk assessment. So here are the risk pathways for the entry of AHS virus into New Zealand. We select a horse for export, and the potential outcomes are the horse is viremic when imported, or as we'll see, not viremic. So important steps to consider along the way are, is AHS virus cycling in your country or the region of Southern South Africa? Is the horse recently vaccinated because of the potential of reversion of that virus could become lethal? Or has the horse been treated with contaminated equipment where we might have iatrogenic transmission of the virus? Excuse me. So we have a horse that's selected. If it's selected outside of the vector season, then we're confident that that horse will not be viremic. I think it's important to say that once the animal is selected, it's not going to be showing clinical signs, and it will be tested. It should not have a fever. Otherwise, you would not go to the expense of exporting or attempting to export that animal into the country, because you know upon arrival, the animal will be detected, or it may be held in quarantine and shortly after introduction be detected. So you don't want to go to the expense of shipping a known infected animal with the hope that it might be missed. So if you ship the animal during the vector season, then there's the possibility that the horse will be viremic, missed upon exit from the country of origin. And if it were viremic, it would be imported into the country and could be missed upon entry, depending on how long it takes and depending on how long that animal has been shipped and how long it's kept in quarantine. If it's not viremic, is the animal recently vaccinated? If it were recently vaccinated, then you have to wait the 21 days to see if you have that virulence arising from the vaccination. So if that does not occur, is the animal potentially going to be treated for some reason? Is it going to be vaccinated for another reason? And if vaccinated, but if it's not viremic, then you're not going to have a problem with the entrance into the population. But if it is viremic, then you've got introduction into the population with a viremic animal. Or, okay, so we've got the three possibilities of how an animal could be introduced into the population. And we need to now look at the possibility of that viremic animal having the virus escape into the population of equines. So that's the next step. What are the exposure pathways for AHS virus if you have the introduction into the population? So we've got a viremic horse that's imported, and we want to see what sort of spread might occur. And here we've got the susceptible horse population, but then we also have another potential host, the canine, the dog that could be exposed from the infected animal. So steps to be considered are carcass disposal, treatment of the horse. Again, this is going to be veterinary treatments or potentially stud treatment or stud exposure. And potential exposure to naive horses in the population. So we have this viremic horse. It may die from the viremia because, as I said, mortality can be very high. And if it does die, the carcass will need to be disposed of. What's going to happen? How will the carcass be disposed? Will it be fed? Will it be ground up and fed as dog food? In which case, a dog may be exposed. And I'm not sure if the chilicoides can infect or can transmit from an infected dog or not, but we have potential of another host in the population that could be of concern in either case. Now, if it's not fed to the dogs, then we have no problem. The dog will not be exposed, not be infected. If, on the other hand, the horse survives, and as I've said, there might be mild fever, maybe it will not be detected. If it is detected, maybe the horse is treated for that purpose or another purpose, in which case, if it is not treated, then the animal will not expose other horses, and end of story in that point right there. If the horse were treated while viremic, there's potential contamination of surgical equipment or needles that are used. If the equipment is contaminated, then you could subsequently infect another horse in your population, a naive horse. And if that naive horse is infected, there's the possibility of it being infected and becoming an infected susceptible horse. And that's basically the only way that we're going to see exposure is through contamination of equipment or needles and subsequently infected another horse. And that's because of the situation in New Zealand. We don't have the chilicoides midges or gnats to infect susceptible horses from a viremic horse. Summary of these risk factors, relevant risk factors. Southern Africa, it's endemic. It's been introduced, AHS has been introduced into other countries with transient infections. The potential vector is not existent in New Zealand, so the likelihood of spread in that way is very low. Horses and dogs are the only susceptible species, and I'm thinking of dogs as a dead-end host. The virus can be transmitted, on the other hand, iatrogenetically through surgical equipment or vaccines. The vaccine is, the virus is viremic for a short period of time, maybe 3 weeks. And they're in limited numbers of routes of exposure, as I talked about. One of the other routes of exposure is through coitus or artificial insemination, but it's unlikely that would occur in the first 3 weeks of the animal's life within the country. So minimal risk really involved in most of these paths, but we'll look at them in more detail. So again, the exposure pathway, the likely of that pathway occurring, and an explanation of the pathway. The insect vector, as I said, is not there, so we could discount that risk, that pathway, as being negligible because we don't have the vector. Iatrogenic, it's very low because the sanitary practices of veterinarians are very good in New Zealand. Needle sharing is not common. So we'll list that as very low. We could, I don't know, almost say it's negligible, but for the process of the study, let's say it's very low. Meat fed to dogs, again, very low probability of that occurring. It could be cooked, which would lower the risk of transmission there, as well. So we'll classify that as very low likelihood. Semen transmission. Again, I said it's unlikely that the horses would be used for insemination purposes, so we can discount that as negligible. All right, so we've got the introduction of the virus. It's escaped into a single animal in the population. Now, what's the likelihood of spread further into that population? Number one, it might not spread at all. It might stay in that horse and go no further. Secondly, it could be spread to animals within the farm, but quickly stopped, recognized, and stopped at the farm level. Thirdly, it might spread beyond the farm level into other populations, and this could be spread by neighboring contact or a veterinarian going from farm to farm and not properly cleaning his tools or her tools in between, and spread it on a much wider level. Ultimately, there's the possibility, highly unlikely, of this becoming a nationwide spread epidemic and becoming endemic ultimately. But again, highly unlikely scenario. So again, looking at the consequence, we're looking at expanding from various levels, either at the farm, at the pen level, all the way up to the national level, and assessing the consequence of each of these events occurring, spreads occurring. Again, the levels at which spread might occur are it'll stay within the stable, stay within the horse, single horse within the stable, spread to multiple horses within the stable, in which case the likelihood of spreading outside would be greater to other horses in the locality, or whatever the veterinarian's clientele may include. Could be on a regional level, and ultimately could be on a national level, and we'll have to assess the consequences of each of those events occurring. And to do this, we can create the scenario tree again. And if you can simply visualize this as you go from left to right and up the ladder, it's becoming more expensive spread. from the individual horse to horses within the stable, to horses in the local area, to horses in the region, the national level. And as it spreads up the ladder, the consequence becomes more dramatic, as you can see on the far right-hand side here, or the ideal situation, and probably the more likely situation, is that it will not spread to another animal, or if it does spread to another horse within the stable, it'll be controlled and no outbreak would subsequently occur. So the likelihood of the spread, it's a low likelihood, very short term. If identified, when identified, we're looking at viremia again of 21 days. And if it does occur, it's going to be very localized, we anticipate. Now there's a very, very negligible spread of horses into a larger level, such as the regional, district, or national level. Now the magnitude, we need to consider this for the consequence assessment. At any level that's going to be negligible, but on an individual animal level, for that animal that's infected, obviously, if it dies, it's going to be very extreme and have a major biologic consequence for that animal. But more likely, it's going to be limited, and the cost associated with that infection is going to be more associated with the control and investigation. So case follow-ups and tracings of the animal and the veterinary movement that was involved that could spread beyond the farm onto other farms and a larger level. And this is one of the ways that it could spread beyond the local level. If for some reason, if the animal were shipped outside of its local region, it could go to a regional level or a national level, or if a veterinarian traveled a far distance without correctly decontaminating his or her equipment, then it could spread to a larger level. But more commonly, it's going to spread in that latter form from the local farm to the regional up to the national level, potentially. So to summarize the results and the conclusions of the entry, exposure, and the consequence, I think we've done that. It's not very likely, but there's a potential, and I think we want to follow through that potential very low, negligible risk of transmission occurring beyond the individual infected animal that we can look at in a subsequent risk management that Noel is going to be talking about in a couple of minutes here. So going through this in more detail, we're doing the entry assessment. We're looking at, is the entry into our country going to be negligible? And to do that, we're looking at the country of origin in Southern Africa, and we're looking at, is the virus cycling, and that's dependent on the midge or the chelocortes being active or not. And here's a figure I took showing that there are certain times of the years that the midge will be active, and that's going to be virus circulating time. And those are the times that there is relatively high risk that an animal could be infected and viremic. And it's more likely that when testing the animal, you will detect it. But if it's recently infected, you may miss the viremia because it hasn't developed, and it could develop subsequently. So if you're outside of these high transmission periods, then the likelihood of an individual animal being infected and subsequently viremic is very low. Now, if we look at exposure coming into the country and infecting other animals, we've gone through those steps and looking at the likelihood of horses or dogs becoming infected and how that might occur. In New Zealand, we don't have the insect vectors, and I say we because Noel and I spent several years there in various jobs working with people in the country and have a bit of a knowledge of that country. So no midges, and it's very low that contamination or spread may occur through the route of contaminated equipment or needles. Consequence, as I said before, there's not going to be an environmental consequence associated with this. The economic impact is going to be to the individual animal and subsequent follow-ups, tracings, surveillance that might be involved with regulatory individuals. So even though the likelihood is very low of spread, we are looking at potentially a high consequence for the individual animal. Now, we have the entry, we have the exposure, and we have the consequence assessments done. Take all this information for the risk estimation, combine them, and come up with the following conclusions. We've got a negligible risk for the virus to become established. If it were introduced into an infected animal, it's unlikely that it's going to spread. However, if it does, and it has an infection that is rather extreme, affecting the pulmonary, cardiac, or mixed forms of the disease, it could be very biologically important, especially to the infected animal. So based on these findings, we can say that the consequence is greater than negligible. Therefore, this risk assessment warrants a risk management. And then we move on to that. Try to move on to that. Okay, and so that concludes my part of the study. And the next part would be for Noel to continue with the risk management of AHS in New Zealand. So I thank you for your time, and I will entertain a question if you have it, or pass it on to Noel.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So Thomas, I'd suggest we have a break. It'd be a good time to have a break because we've been in a session now for a while, and then we can come back and discuss the risk management step, which shouldn't take too long. And then there'll be an opportunity for some discussion as a group before we look at the presentations from tasks from last week. Does that sound reasonable? How long would you like for a break, Thomas?
Yes,
10 minutes?
Yeah, 10 minutes. 10 minutes,
okay.
we take a 10 minutes break. And then we reconvene after the 10 minutes elapse, so that you continue to impart more knowledge on us, to know what we want to do, and so that we can get an understanding, to get to know how we can tackle risk assessment. So the break starts now.
Okay, thank you. See you in 10 minutes.
The countdown for the break is almost gone. We are in the last 30 seconds of the break. So we should be, I don't know, there's one of our participants from Botswana who sent a message that he cannot hear anything. I don't know if he can hear me now. Botswana. Okay, I think we are done with the break. Noel, I'd want to hand over to you to continue from where we stopped. Over to you, Noel.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so we're going to continue on with the discussion on risk analysis, looking at the OIE framework. And now we're going to turn our attention to the risk management aspect. So just before we jump into that, I just wanted to say that, you know, this session today is really trying to discuss the general principles of import risk analysis under the OIE framework with some practical examples based on actual risk analyses that have been undertaken in the past. So while we're not specifically mentioning African swine fever, the opportunity will come when we have when we set an exercise later on in this session to apply it to your particular situation for African swine fever. And I think importantly, this framework provides opportunities for other diseases as well into the future. So it really provides us with a toolbox that's quite flexible and adaptable to your particular situation. Okay, so we're going to look now at identifying, selecting and implementing measures to mitigate risk. And basically an overview of the steps involved in risk management, the role that it plays in facilitating safe international trade, and an example, continuing on our example with African horse sickness virus. This example was one that I developed when I was working in New Zealand back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it is, as Tim indicated, in the OIE's handbook on import risk analysis. So risk management itself is essentially the process of identifying, selecting and implementing measures to effectively mitigate risk. And that risk is posed by the hazard associated with the particular commodity under consideration. So it really isn't acceptable just to simply identify a range of measures that might reduce the risk. As we've indicated previously, there must be a rational relationship between the measure or the measures that you choose and the risk assessment, so that the results of the risk assessment actually support the measures that are being implemented. This is an important discipline also under the SPS agreement. So the objective of is obviously to manage the risks effectively so that we can minimize the likelihood or prevent the likelihood of disease incursions, to participate fairly in international trade, and as well as fulfilling our obligations under the SPS agreement. So there are 4 steps involved in risk management: risk evaluation, followed by option evaluation, implementation, monitoring, and review. And we'll look at each one of these in turn. So for risk evaluation, the risk estimate, the outcome from the risk assessment step, the risk estimate is compared to the country's so-called appropriate level of protection. And this is a concept that's embedded in the SPS agreement. It's also maybe referred to as the acceptable level of risk. So what is it? It's essentially the level of risk that's considered to be compatible with protecting both public and animal health. It's reflecting the balance that a country wishes to achieve between its desire to participate in international trade and the associated disease risks. It's essentially a societal or political judgment where it's each country's sovereign right to set its own appropriate level of protection. Now, importantly, there's really no unique or defined level, so you can't actually enunciate it as such. But and some countries have actually tried to do that, but I don't think any country's been really successful in defining a particular level. But what it actually is, it's a concept that demands consistency in the application of measures. And I think that concept of consistency is really important. So I gave you an example before where Australia had imposed a prohibition on importing wild-caught Pacific salmon from Canada because of disease concerns associated with Eromonas salmonacida, yet they were not imposing any measures whatsoever for the importation of ornamental fish that may have been affected by the same pathogen. So obviously in that situation, there was a profound inconsistency in the application of the measures. So under the provisions of the SPS agreement, as we saw before, there shouldn't be any restrictions on trade unless it's likely that a disease may enter, establish or spread and lead to unacceptable consequences. So essentially, if the risk estimate's greater than the importing country's appropriate level of protection, then we can conclude that sanitary measures may be justified. So pragmatically, if the risk estimate is greater than negligible, then we can conclude that sanitary measures are justified. So what is meant by negligible? I mean, basically it means not worthy of further consideration. That would be a dictionary definition. So in terms of the risk estimate arising from a risk assessment, if we conclude that the risk is of such a low level that it's not worthy of further consideration, that's what we mean by negligible. So we can sort of set the bar as, is the risk negligible or non-negligible? That would be a decision point, if you like. And it's essential that the risk be assessed in a consistent and transparent manner as well. So we turn attention now to option evaluation. This is where we identify potential sanitary measures. They are evaluated and selected to effectively manage the risk. We've already discussed that. So the measures themselves should be feasible, technically, operationally, as well as economically. They should only be implemented to the extent that's reasonably necessary to protect either human or animal health. They should be consistent with their obligations as members of WTO as well as OIE. And as I say, applied consistently across a range of commodities that likely contain the same or similar hazards to avoid those situations where different levels of protection arise. So that could easily result in discrimination and trade disputes. Obviously, the OIE standards are the preferred choice, and where they don't exist or where the proposed measure results in a higher level of protection than that afforded by the OIE standard, then the measure itself or the measures must be supported by a transparently documented risk analysis. So in the case I gave you before, the example with Korea imposing a blanket prohibition on Canadian beef, that was obviously an extremely restrictive measure. Unfortunately, for Korea, the measure itself wasn't supported by a risk analysis. We repeatedly asked for them to provide us a transparently documented risk analysis. They were not forthcoming. And that led to a trade dispute that was ultimately brought forth to the World Trade Organization through the dispute resolution process there. And eventually a bilateral solution was reached, but it resulted in significant issues for both countries for many years. Completely avoidable if only a transparently documented risk analysis was provided. So to assist in identifying options, it's important to formulate an objective which clearly states the intended outcome of the measure. And that objective is informed by the risk pathways leading from the likelihood of introducing the hazard, the exposure of susceptible animals or humans in your country, and of significant consequences arising. And the objective itself should be quite specific. So for example, for African horse sickness, we might formulate an objective that states to effectively manage the risks associated with the virus, sanitary measures should ensure that the imported horses are not viremic. So we have a clear understanding of what the objective of the measures or measure is. Then we can select an option or a combination of options that will achieve our level of protection. We need to ensure that the code's measures are considered, and if there's sufficient justification that the code's measures will not effectively achieve a particular country's appropriate level of protection, measures that result in a higher level of protection may be applied. However, the rationale needs to be explicit in a transparently documented risk analysis. Of course, less stringent measures than those recommended in the code may also be applied where there's sufficient justification that the risk can be effectively managed using those less stringent measures. It's important to ensure that the options are not chosen or applied arbitrarily. They must be based on scientific principles, which is best elaborated in the risk analysis, where we're obviously evaluating the likelihood of the entry, exposure, establishment and spread of the hazard, together with an estimate of the likely magnitude and the likelihood of occurrence of various consequences, according to the options that might be applied. So this is when we go back and revisit some of that work. At what points in the pathway are we going to intervene, and how does that impact on the overall risk estimate? It's important to ensure that negative trade effects are minimized. The options should be, I think we've said this before, technically, operationally and economically feasible and only applied to the extent necessary. Am I going backwards here? Yeah, so it's important to avoid situations where some parts of the risk pathway are overmanaged. We need to consider each option from the perspective of the entire risk pathway, not simply in isolation. And this is important because if we focus on the measures being technically, operationally, and economically feasible, if we end up over-managing risk, it could be very, very costly and maybe not feasible. So we need to look at the entire risk pathway and evaluate the contribution of a particular option in terms of reducing the overall risk. And if that particular option, its contribution to the overall risk is insignificant or negligible, we could conclude that it's effectively redundant and maybe we could drop it for further consideration. If these options are chosen, obviously they would create unnecessary and unjustifiable challenges, either technically or operationally, and perhaps an unwarranted inflation and cost as well associated with the importation. So in most, if not all situations, it's not necessary to apply a measure at each and every step in the risk pathway. We need to be strategic about it. So we need to ensure that the options do not result in discrimination between an importing and exporting country where similar conditions exist, or preferential treatment is granted to one exporting country over another where similar conditions exist. And there certainly have been examples of such discrimination in the past, where two countries may have the same or similar disease risks, yet preference is given to one country over another. It's important to assure that the measures are applied consistently across a range of commodities that are likely to contain the same or similar hazard, to avoid those situations where different levels of protection arise. And I've already given you the example with the wild-caught Pacific salmon from Canada and the ornamental fish importation into Australia. So next we turn attention to implementation, where the focus is on reaching the final decision on the measures to be adopted. The risk analysis itself provides recommendations on whether or not the measures can be justified, and if they are, what type of measures may be required. But what other factors may be taken into account in reaching a final decision? What are they? Are there any non-disease associated effects considered? How are they taken into account? And if they are, they would need to be transparently documented. Remember that any non-disease associated effects are really outside the scope of an animal health import risk analysis under the OIE framework, as well as the SPS agreement. So we need to clarify who's making the decision. Is it the Chief Veterinary Officer, another official from the competent authority or the veterinary service, or perhaps it occurs at a political level? So there could be some other folks who are responsible for making the decision. Nevertheless, regardless of who's making the decision, ideally that decision process should be transparently documented. The rationale for any decisions that are not based or supported by the risk analysis need to be transparently documented. This is probably very difficult to achieve, particularly if it's a politically based or motivated decision, but nevertheless, ideally that should occur. So it's important that trading partners are fully aware and understand why a particular decision is being reached. That's an obligation under the SPS agreement. As Thomas indicated in an earlier session, WTO members have an obligation to notify other members through the SPS Secretariat of measures that are new or perhaps changed, that are not based on an existing international standard, or where an international standard doesn't actually exist, and where those measures are likely to have a significant effect on trade. It's important that a sufficient amount of time, and 60 days is recommended, be allowed for comment to be taken and amendments to be introduced and exporters to adapt. And that should be the normal course of events. So less than course circumstances are urgent or it's an emergency situation. But in most situations, we need to allow a sufficient period of consultation to occur with members. So where the circumstances are urgent, the proposed measures must still be notified with a brief introduction of the objective and rationale for the measure, including the nature of the urgency. And then members must still be extended the opportunity to comment and their comments taken into account. In that situation, the measure will be implemented, but still, following that implementation of that measure, members should still be granted the opportunity to comment. In terms of monitoring and review, this is where the measures themselves are audited to ensure that they're achieving the results intended. So, for example, the evaluation of compliance with certification requirements, and perhaps there may be an on-site inspection visit from the officials from the importing country may visit the exporting country to look at how the various measures are being implemented in the exporting country as a measure of enhancing their confidence. So the steps identified in the risk assessment, which have the greatest impact on the risk, particularly those with the greatest level of uncertainty, should be identified and updated as new information becomes available. This is part of monitoring and review. So it's important to consider that risk factors are dynamic and may be adversely affected by change. They're not static, they do change, obviously. Changes in animal disease status of the exporting country, or perhaps even neighboring countries or regions, may have implications. There may be major political changes or social instability that impact on risk factors. Natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, fires, etc. There may be significant changes in economic circumstances that impact on risk factors as well. So obviously they're dynamic. But let's look at an example building on the African horse sickness virus example from New Zealand. So the first step in evaluating risk So the conclusions arising from the risk estimate step in the risk assessment were that African horse sickness virus, the risk estimate is greater than negligible, and sanitary measures may be needed to achieve New Zealand's appropriate level of protection. So the objective in this case, we're formulating an objective to effectively manage the risks. Sanitary measures should ensure that imported horses are not viremic. And what sort of options might be available? So here are some considerations. So commercial vaccines are unlikely to prevent viremia. The only means available to ensure that the imported horse is not viremic is to ensure they're either come from a free country or seasonally free zone, seasonally free zone, or they're protected from insect vectors for a period equal to the maximum duration of viremia plus the incubation period. And then since the incubation period may be up to 14 days and viremia may last up to 21 days, horses would obviously need to be protected from vectors for up to 35 days. So this is providing a rationale for a potential measure. And the duration of viremia following vaccination was considered to be similar to that resulting from a natural challenge. So what sort of sanitary options are available in the code? There are standards defining a free country or free or seasonally free zone, as well as the conditions for importing horses from them, which would include that the animal not be vaccinated within the last 40 days, that the animal is kept in a free country or zone for at least 40 days, or in a seasonally free zone during the seasonally free period for at least 40 days. So looking now at importing horses from an infected country or zone, requirement that they not be vaccinated within the last 40 days, as well as being held in isolation in an establishment protected from vectors for at least 28 days with a negative test after 28 days, and so on. So we can see there's a range of options that the code does provide. So essentially, the OIE standards are consistent with the objective of ensuring that the imported horse or horses are not viremic. They provide an appropriate measure to mitigate against the risks associated with African horse sickness virus for horses imported from either a free country or free or seasonally free zones or an infected country or zone. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation on a bit of an overview of risk management with a practical example. All right, so we'll stop sharing the screen. And we can now look at a discussion about the risk analysis framework provided by the OIE. If anybody has any questions or comments, we'll spend a little bit of time discussing those. I'm just looking at the comment box here. So somebody was asking about environmental consequences. Does it mean you should have an environmental expert as part of the risk assessment team? Yeah, I think, and that's a really key sort of issue, the concept of team, a team. It's highly unlikely that any one of us has all the necessary skills available to us to undertake a thorough risk analysis. So if there are issues that we need to consider beyond our particular level of expertise, we do need to consult other experts as well. As far as an environmental, I'm not sure you'd need necessarily an environmental expert per se, but what we're thinking there is if there's potential for spillover into wild populations, for example, then you'd need somebody with those sort of skills to at least consult with as the risk analysis is undertaken. I think someone asked about a landfill. That was answered by Tim in the chat. A place where waste is disposed of also may be referred to as a dump. or in some countries, maybe a tip. Okay. All right, so that's the questions from the chat. Has anybody else got any comments or questions? Observations? One just appeared. Any documents on the acceptable level of risk by any country? Yeah, as I indicated, I think some countries have attempted to try and define the acceptable level of risk, either as, you know, quantitatively, perhaps, what is meant by that. I don't, from my knowledge, no country has really ultimately been successful in doing that. And we've had lots of discussions over many years about this. How do you enunciate the appropriate level of protection? And really, it just comes down to, at the end of the day, is the risk likely to be considered negligible or non-negligible? And to say that it's not, that it's negligible, is based on a detailed evaluation of the attendant risk factors and the transparent documentation of that rationale, subject to peer review, to ensure that the outcome is as objective as you can reasonably achieve. And so that everybody who's looking at the analysis can have a good understanding of why you've concluded that in this circumstance, the risk estimate is either negligible or non-negligible. And if it's non-negligible, maybe it's nuanced by an indication that it's highly likely, it's moderately likely, there's a low likelihood of something happening. But it is transparently documented, so you have an understanding. If we look at each of these words in isolation without preceding discussion, it's very difficult to try and understand or comprehend what is meant. It really is a process that we have to go through to document our findings, so that people can look at that and come away with a much more in-depth understanding. And as I indicated before too, the acceptable level of risk is really something that demands consistency. So and certainly some of the jurisprudence that's arisen through various WTO panels or appellate bodies has really underscored the concept of appropriate level of protection or acceptable level of risk as being one that ensures consistency across a range of commodities that may or may not pose similar levels of risk. But consistency is the key really there. So it's not an easy one to try and wrap your mind around, but and there's no country to my mind has really documented clearly. I don't think it's possible to really do that, but just bear in mind that it's really the principal objective, I guess, of appropriate level of protection or acceptable level of risk is to require countries to transparently document their rationale and to ensure consistency across a range of commodities. Okay, any other questions, comments? Tim, have you got any observations or comments? You're on mute. Tim, you're on mute.
You don't have to shout, but maybe you do to get my attention. I'm thinking about countries that are endemic with foot and mouth disease. There may be a justifiable risk in not accepting imports into a country if the importing country has an accelerated program where they're trying to reduce the prevalence of foot and mouth disease, or if they have a zone or regions in the country that are FMD free that they don't want animals imported into, or they have a different strain that the exporting country has that the importing country may not have. So just variations.
Okay, so perhaps if there's no further questions or discussion about risk analysis, we could maybe introduce the exercise or the task for participants to embark on the next week. And then we could look at turning it over for the discussion for the tasks from last week. So I'll just bring up the task for next week here. Okay, just share my screen. That should be it. Okay. Okay, so we're going to set an exercise or a task, if you like, applying the OIE import risk analysis framework to African swine fever. So depending on your particular circumstance. So as we've seen from Tim's presentation, the use of scenario trees can be really quite useful to help in thinking through the various risk pathways relevant for entry and exposure assessment. So I'd like you to have a go at mapping out the risk pathways associated with African swine fever in a commodity of your choosing. So whether you're thinking about live animals, semen, meat products, something like that, but just think about a particular commodity and map out the risk pathways that would lead to the entry of African swine fever virus in that commodity at the time of importation or introduction into a particular compartment it might be. We don't necessarily need to think about the international level here. We could be looking at moving commodities from one particular area into an area like a concept like a compartment where you have a different level of biosecurity. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a national border. And then once you've mapped out those pathways, what factors do you need to consider? And then provide some examples for both the entry and exposure assessment. And then we need to think about some potential consequences. So what factors might you need to consider there, and provide some examples as well. We can look at, I'd like you to identify a couple of potential outbreak scenarios and then estimate the likely magnitude of the consequences for each one of those at various levels. And it could be either the smallholder or farm level, perhaps a district or regional, or perhaps even national level, depending on the particular example you've chosen. And then I'd like you to have a go at estimating the likelihood, combining it, bringing it all together to estimate the likelihood of entry, exposure, establishment, or spread of African swine fever virus, as well as estimating the likely magnitude and likelihood of consequences that might arise. Then that naturally leads us to whether sanitary measures can be justified for African swine fever virus in the chosen commodity. And then think about what options might be available to mitigate that risk, how those options importantly are related to the risk assessment, and then what factors might you need to consider when developing sanitary measures. Okay, so that's the exercise. Hopefully there's enough guidance there to give you an outline of what we're hoping to achieve. So today we've looked at the general principles of import risk analysis as provided by the OIE's framework, and with some practical examples. And you can use that, refer back to that as reference material or whatever to assist you in focusing on a particular commodity of your choosing with African swine fever as the hazard of interest. I see Tim's got his hand up.
Yep. Thanks, Noel. What I'd like to reiterate is that in doing these assessments, that you go back through the presentations that have been given to date. So I think there's a lot of information there for you to build on and make for a very good case. So, and keeping in mind that you can't do this by yourself, so you need additional information that you've been presented over the last few weeks. And secondly, I'd like to say, make sure you keep this simple to begin with. And as it starts to flesh out, build up, then you can make it more complex and realistic. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That's wise counsel. Okay. So stop sharing the screen. We've got a couple of no, I don't think there's any further questions. Okay. So Thomas, if there's no questions on the exercise for next week, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Noel and Tim, for those able presentations, and you've imparted a lot of knowledge to the group today. Immediately the session ends, I'll send all the presentations which are presented today, including that particular task, the homework which has been given by the two trainers today, and so that you can be able to do the needful. At that juncture, I want to call on Jermaine, who has been waiting all through, so that she can go through the presentations which were for last week. And there's one more which was added from Botswana. I'm sure you have also seen it. So now over to you, Jermaine, for that session.
Thank you, Thomas. Hi again, everyone. So I would like to thank all those who completed the homework. Really excellent responses from the different countries, and well done. So through the exercises, we hope you have a better orientation around the use of compartmentalization, not just to facilitate trade, but also for disease control. And I hope that you have also started looking at the OIE compartmentalization guidelines and to start thinking about how that could potentially be applied in your locality. And it was also nice to see that there was a balance in the number of attempts for each task. Just to recap again, task 1 was about designing a compartment to get you thinking about potential commodities to be derived, and from there, what establishments should be considered to be included in a compartment. And task 2 was a bit related to today's session as well. It's on the identification of risk pathways for ASF entry into a compartment and the risk mitigation measures to address this risk. So 3 countries worked on task 1. I believe we have Kenya, Namibia, and Zambia. And in the interest of time, can I suggest that we get started with the country presentations for task 1? And we can follow that up with a discussion. So without further ado, could I perhaps invite Kenya, our colleagues from Kenya, to share your presentation and to give us a walkthrough about what you have discussed within your group. Do we have any representative?
Samuel Kahariri from Kenya. Maybe you can, Jermaine, you can help him share the screen for that presentation. then he can follow. Samuel, are you
Give me a
there?
second.
Sorry, Doc. Hello?
Are you sharing or you want Jermaine to share for you?
I can share.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me see if I can be able to. Let me see. Sorry. You can see it, eh?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so sorry for that. Yeah, see, so this is a presentation for Kenya. And this was the homework that we were working on with regard to zoning and compartmentalization. So we chose task 1, which was talking of based on chapter 4.5, application of compartmentalization of the terrestrial animal health code and principles in the compartmentalization guidelines, page 15 to 17. Think about elements to consider when designing compartment and apply it to a real life situation. Question, and the following were the questions to be answered. The first one was, what are the intended commodities to be derived from compartment? And then what are the units, that is establishments, to be included in the compartment and why? And then we was also supposed to explain the functional relationships. So looking at it, we intended commodities for our case was live pigs and pork products. Those were the two focus products. Of course, not forgetting that we, as we agreed last time, you can have a compartment for various compartments for various animal species, depending on your interest. So some of the key considerations as we do this is that the need for the implementation and documentation of management and biosecurity measures to create a functional separation of the subpopulations. As we said, the main strength and the success of the of these compartments will be based on a successful separation of the OSF virus-free population and the ones that are supposed to be the ones that are infected. The other thing is the consideration about the epidemiological factors that could help to create an effective disease-specific separation between the subpopulations. Because sometimes we could separate things physically, but then other factors like movement, transportation, and others could then be interfering with the separation. So the functional units that we are thinking about, we thought feed mills, because the pigs normally are feeding on some commercial feeds, mostly commercial feeds, especially for the compartments. We recommended that we would just consider the feed mills, slaughterhouses, and abattoirs, because these are very key areas when it comes, and important when it comes to the spread of ASF. The processing plants, because we have some remnants of these pork and pork products, and therefore also associated to the processing, the rendering plants. Also, we thought one of the other units could be in the compartment is the breeding, because of the practice that is happening in Kenya, where some farmers are borrowing male boars from others and using for that purpose. So we said one of the units could be the breeding, and then common biosecurity management system to cap all these, so that then when we are thinking about these units, we can actually have consideration for all of their biosecurity management systems as a unit which we are calling the compartment. Inputs and the services supplies, like the vets who are offering these services and other regular services to these enterprises, we also thought to consider them as a key unit. Then the transport system for that, for the products, inputs, and even the pig themselves, we also clustered as a unit for consideration. Meat markets, outlets, and things like butcheries are also key units for consideration as we establish our compartments. So for the functional relationships of our units, we said one of the key things is they should be defined as part of the compartments. So when we talk about transportation, we will consider the vehicles or the transport modes that are going to be used in our compartments as part of our compartment, so that when we are assessing the compartments, we consider the standards that they must meet. Even when we are talking about the slaughter or butcheries, we also consider all the standards that they must meet for them to continue, for us to be able to maintain the integrity of our compartment. Applying strict biosecurity measures to maintain African swine fever virus-free status, all unit for all the units that have been identified along the value. So we are saying strict biosecurity measures are going to be maintained in all these. We are going to be looking at the entire value chain within our compartment and require that all the value chain players maintain very high standards of biosecurity measures as per the outlined guidelines. So dedicated to receive only, our compartment will only be dedicated to receive only animals with African swine fever virus-free status. So not just walk in and out for the from the compartments, but there must be procedures to make sure that all that is taken care of. We will develop MOUs Kenya, a big in the success of this. And we also thought of the other stakeholders who are involved. I hope I'm not lost. I hope you can hear me. You can hear me, right?
Yeah, continue.
Yes, we are also going to develop MOUs with other stakeholders so that we can outline the role of each player so that it is very clear. Maintain a traceability system and measures to prevent cross contamination. We said traceability system is one of the key things for us to be able to trace back all these animals and their products and be sure that they have been maintained the required standards. We're also having strict segregation measures in time and space, because we realize depending on when the animal is coming and when it's held where, so we are going to segregate that and have that managed along the entire chain again. So disease surveillance by the veterinary authority is also going to be upheld and also intensified, particularly in the compartment, so that then we can make sure we can be able to capture the things, or the things that are lapse to the biosecurity measures. I think that is what we agreed, and we also agreed that it's actually possible. It's actually possible to establish compartments in Kenya but of course, not without challenges. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Karire. Over to you, Jermaine.
Right, thanks. Thanks, Samuel, for the very comprehensive presentation. Really excellent work done. I like the point about the focus on transport vehicles as well, noting that these vehicles could be a source for ASF introduction and also transmission. So that was a really important point to take into consideration, the vehicles that are involved within the compartment. And also the fact that you mentioned about the strict segregation in time and space. Certainly that's really relevant as well, especially in situations where, for example, the slaughterhouse processing the pigs may also end up processing pigs from outside the compartment. So how do we ensure that these pigs do not inevitably or inadvertently get infected with ASF? That's through very clear spatial and temporal segregation. So really, really good job. I'll now like to invite Peter to say a few words as well. Over to you, Peter. We can't hear you. Sorry.
I don't see Peter in the list, Charmaine, unless I'm mistaken.
I know Peter is there. I can see
Oh yes,
him
he's there. Yes,
speaking,
I
but
see
I
him now.
can't
Yes.
hear him. Yeah.
Is my
We can't
microphone
hear
working
him.
now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Now
Yeah,
it works.
Sorry, it was set to the wrong microphone. Yeah, so very holistic approach to compartmentalization from the Kenyan team. I think maybe some of the what you were discussing there was implementation of compartments and structuring a compartment system. I like the way that you started right at the beginning at the feed mills. And as Charmaine said, understanding the risks, particularly the transport, risk of getting ASF into compartments. I think one of the things that everybody should add into their strategy on compartments is how you're going to do awareness and training of the farmers and the participants in the whole chain. So, you need to be able to change people's behavior and get them to understand that being a compartment doesn't necessarily make you biosecure. It's the way you behave within that system that's important. So add training and awareness, continual training and awareness. So yeah, good one. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Perhaps now we can hear from the other participants. Do you have any questions for Kenya? Or the other trainers as well, feel free to chip in. If not, perhaps we can move on to the presentation from Namibia. Do we have a representative from Namibia at this meeting?
So Simpson, you're there. You want to make the presentation?
Yes, Thomas. Thank you. I will make the presentation. Can Charmaine just assist me to share the presentation? Sorry, Charmaine. I don't think the screen is showing yet. Charmaine, can you hear me?
Yes, can you see my screen?
Yes, it shows
Says
that
it's loading, but it's
Coming up.
taking a
I
bit
think it's
time.
loading.
Yeah. Sorry, I think because the file is really huge and my laptop is
Maybe you unshare.
It's loading slowly, I think.
You unshare. I tried to share from mine.
okay.
Okay.
Let's do that. Sorry.
Slaughtering.
Okay. Who is sharing now? Is it Thomas or Charmaine?
Thomas is sharing the slides.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, colleagues. From Namibia, we chose the task number 1 of designing a compartment. So we really try to be brief with our presentation. And Thomas, can you just go straight to the presentation? I think the answers are still below. Okay. Thank you, Thomas. Yes, we thought of a compartment which is, because when we were reading, a compartment can actually be a farm that is completely fenced off, that meets all the biosecurity measures. So now within this compartment, the commodity that we have decided will be derived from this compartment is pork, and then processed pork products for local or export market. And within this compartment, we decided that there's going to be 4 units that are going to be included in this compartment. So we have a pig city for breeding stock, and then we have a pig city for weaning stock, another unit for slaughter-ready stock, and then we have an abattoir and a processing plant. So we chose these units particularly because we want to keep or to maintain a crosshead for the purpose of disease control, so that there's no risk of introduction of ACF in the compartment coming through other pigs that were introduced. So the idea is to produce the pigs from a younger age until they are ready for slaughter. And of course, we are going to maintain biosecurity measures, or to enforce biosecurity measures within the compartment. So all these, each unit is going to have specific biosecurity measures in place. And of course, traceability is also going to be in place, and all this. So the only thing we didn't consider on this one is, it only came up now when I see when Kenya presented our source of feed, but we can see it. It's still possible that we can find a source that doesn't present any risk at all, which can fit in this compartment. And our functional relationship. Now, since this compartment have a unit for breeding stock, so the functional relationship is that we are going to be producing our own pigs, right? The breeding stock is going to sustain the weaning stock, and then after they reach a certain weight, we then move them to the abattoir when they are ready for slaughter, and then they are slaughtered there, and then we can either export the product as pork, out of the compartment into the market, or we can also, the product can also go further to the pork can go to the processing plant for further processing for salami, polonies, and others. And also these are also exported out of the compartment. So I think with that, we can assure our trading partners that the product is completely clean and very safe and does not present any risk of African swine fever. I think that is all we have prepared, and that brings me to the end of our presentation. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Over to you, Jermaine.
Thank you, Simpson, for the presentation. Can I maybe open the floor for any comments on Namibia's presentation? Any questions? Okay, we have a raised hand from Uganda. Sorry, I don't see the name. Please go ahead.
Israel.
Israel, please unmute your microphone. Okay, he says he can't unmute his microphone.
Do we have any questions from anyone else? Perhaps in the meantime, Israel, you can take the opportunity to type something in the chat. Okay, so the presentation from Namibia brought up some interesting points as well. I think Simpson mentioned during his presentation that there would be some considerations with regards to the input, like feed, because noting that this could be a potential source of ASF introduction, but he also rightly explained that not all these units have to be in a compartment. So what a compartment is you need to have a subpopulation of pigs, and then you include the establishments that are related to this compartment that are under the same biosecurity management system. However, we know that there are some input sources that might not necessarily be within the compartment. For example, if your feed is imported. So it is unrealistic to expect that the feed may also end up in the compartment. It's a bit difficult to coordinate. So what happens is, Simpson is right that we have to ensure that the feed come from certified sources that are free from ASF. This could be in the form of, we could also request for good manufacturing practices certification. So it is correct that, in the consideration of inputs, not all of this must be identified as part of your biosecurity, your compartment system, as long as we make sure that all the risks from ASF are addressed. So the same explanation could also be said for example, bedding, the bedding that we bring into the farm. Now, the other point that I would like to emphasize here is, again, a compartment is not just a high biosecurity farm. There's an entire system to it that involves not just biosecurity, but also surveillance, a robust identification and traceability system, and along with that, the corresponding regulatory framework with the veterinary authority and the necessary approvals, certification process. So it's really more than just a high biosecurity farm. Now, can I invite Peter to say a few words as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So, yeah, I think just to what Charmaine was saying around you know, the input, the particularly feed into the piggery. There's a lot of research going on, particularly amongst our colleagues in the US as to what the potential risk of African swine fever is in feed. They're doing modeling on all sorts of commodities, including corn or maize, on soyas, you know, all ingredients that go into pig feed. So it's a very important part of keeping a compartment free of ASF. But post-manufacturing contamination is a huge risk. And so I would encourage anybody who's designing a compartment system where you want to control or reduce the risk of feed being a source, the post-manufacturing contamination needs to be something that's really looked at, particularly when you are carrying feed around in bags, on open trailers, you know, from a place where you're mixing it to a place where you're feeding your pigs. Those can all be important risks that need to be addressed within that compartment system. The other thing that came out of the presentation was around the processing plant. And certainly that's where traceability becomes really important, and that pigs that have come out of a compartment that are going to a abattoir and a processing facility, potentially to be exported or moved anywhere within a country, there should be some form of documentation. There should be some form of being able to trace back those pigs have come from a compartment, and that the commodities that are coming out of that are safe. So I think you picked up on two really important points: what's coming in, and then the final product, to be able to give assurances that the final product is unlikely to carry virus. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent stuff. Okay, so now we have the questions from Israel in the chat. So the first question to Namibia is it economically feasible to have all these units in one compartment? And how do you identify the source of the breeding pigs?
Can I have a go at that, Charmaine?
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, we're for those of you in my presentation that I gave a week ago, you know, we've had some experience where we've had issues where a compartment's broken out. So the risks of having the whole farrow to finish, so the breeding, the young weaners that are between 3 and 10 weeks of age, and the finishing pigs on the same farm, is that if you have an ASF incursion onto that farm, that means that the whole system is infected. Your whole pig system is infected. If you are able to have multi-site, if you are a big enough farmer to have multi-site where you can have a breeding section, possibly a weaning section on its own, and then a fattening section on its own, and you have very strict internal biosecurity mechanisms within your farm, should you have an incursion of ASF in one of those 3 sites, which make up your whole pig flow from breeding to marketing, you create an opportunity for yourself to limit the disaster, to limit the potential losses. So is it economically feasible to have all these units in one compartment? You know, obviously from a management point of view, it's easy. It's a lot easier to have one manager on particularly slightly smaller farms that can oversee all the units. You must remember that you need to have a downtime between units, and also you need to be showering in and out of your compartment. So if you have a single manager on with 3 units that he has to visit, that manager every day needs to either visit only 1 unit a day, or in between units needs to shower in and out. So one needs to weigh up the size of your business against all the various conditions that you or protocols that you have to have in place, and make some justifiable decisions on what's economically justifiable. The other one, Charmaine, I'm happy for you to answer. How do you identify a source of breeding pigs?
Thanks, Peter. Namibia, Simpson, do you want to add on to that? I think the question was also for Namibia.
If I can, I'm also from Namibia.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Thank you, it's Emmanuel here. Thank you very much for the question. And I also want to thank Simpson for the presentation. He just saved us. Yes, the question is, how do you identify the source of breeding pigs? Okay, these breeding pigs, we will source the breeding pigs from farms that are certified African swine fever free. We also, since we have our own stock, we can also source some of the breeding pigs from our own farm. I mean, the winners that we win, we can select the pigs that we put into breeding. And again, if we source these breeding pigs from outside, we will make sure that we have another unit on the farm where we quarantine them for some time before they are incorporated into with the others that are in a breeding unit. So, and also to make sure that the traceability system, and that those pigs, I mean those farms where we are sourcing them, they conduct sero surveys and other testing for African swine fever, and that they have been free for at least the past 3 months. Yes, I think with those measures, we will ensure that what we bring in is free and we don't jeopardize the status of the compartment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Emmanuel. Very, very clear explanation. Right, can we now invite, I think the last one that attempted past one was Zambia. Sorry, we do have a question. Sorry, hang on. Somebody was there a raised hand?
Yeah, Pasina.
Yes, thank you. I really wanted to ask before the issue of compartmentalization. What do you do in a situation where you have some smallholder farm close by, and you cannot possibly compartmentalize them together with your farm, and they continue to possibly be a source of challenge to your compartmentalized farm? What do you do in such situation?
Can I invite Peter, based on your experience in South Africa? How was that managed?
Oh my word, that's a very difficult one. Besides getting on your knees every night, I'm not sure. I think the important thing is, so there's some of our farmers in the area who've got inventive. For instance, they went to the communal farms around their farm who had pigs, and went into a sort of commercial relationship where they bought all the pigs from these farmers and replaced them with other livestock that the farmers were interested in, either goats or sheep. And there was a clear understanding that they wouldn't farm with pigs on the perimeter of that compartment, that farm. So that's one way of doing it. There is no other way of that I know of stopping those pig farmers. You could suggest, and it would be up to individuals in that area, is, a lot of these farmers, the real risk is if these farmers replenish, these emerging farmers, smallholder farmers, replenish their stock by going to auctions. The compartment in the area could offer to provide or sell pigs that they would otherwise have gone and bought from a unsafe source like a live auction or wherever else they might trade pigs, to trade pigs that from your own farm of a known health status to your neighbors, to try and prevent them bringing in pigs that are potentially harmful. Because I think, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, when I did my presentation, we think that that's a big red flag. Is a lot of smallholder farmers very close to big compartments, or to any compartment, doesn't matter what size it is, to any compartment that have pigs with ASF. I mean, that just because of movement of people and, making sure that you don't transmit it easily. So yeah, it does make, one has to be inventive and clever.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Now we have a raised hand from Mary-Louise.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to say it's a pity that Sharon Sagadi isn't with us today, because Farmers Choice in Kenya, which is their big commercial company, has a whole scheme whereby they integrate as many smallholder farmers as possible into their value chain, and they provide training. They provide a certain amount when they're starting off. They provide support with feed, make sure the housing was okay, and then of course these people are assured of a much better price at the abattoir, at the big Farmers Choice abattoir, for their pigs, so they begin to be able to afford to stand on their own feet and buy more pigs if they want to. And I know that at one session, whether it was in this or another course, I can't remember, but somebody asked Sharon, what is the smallest number of herd? I mean, are these really small farms, or what is the smallest? And she said a lady was 1 sow. So they can integrate very small people who are prepared to take the training, put the necessary biosecurity measures in place, and it does help them to always have a supply of pigs coming in, a guaranteed supply of pigs to supplement what they produce on their own farms.
Okay, thanks very much, Mary-Louise. Perhaps now we have 15 minutes left. Could we move on to the presentation from Zambia?
Let me share for Zambia. Can we see the presentation, Zambia?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, let me put it presentation mode. Slideshow. There you are.
Do we have a speaker from Zambia?
Nawa from Zambia.
I see no one from Zambia in my list, Thomas. I think there was only one person here today,
Yeah.
Nawa, but
Nawa.
he or she must have left.
Yeah, it looks like. Then I don't know, maybe we can I can stop sharing.
Yes.
Do you have another country, Charmaine, or?
No, actually, that was the last presentation for task 1. What do you think, Patrick? Should we move on to task 2, or shall we keep that for the next session? Noting that task 2 is also about a bit about the identification of risk pathways and designing the risk mitigation measures.
I'm not sure. I think we're well into our 3rd hour, so maybe it's better to move this to next week when we probably have a bit more time.
Yeah.
To look at these things. I'm not sure what colleagues think. Thomas, is that okay with you? Noel? Tim is okay. He says okay.
Okay.
That's okay.
Yeah. Good.
I think
if I may, Thomas, I'm going to send all participants a provisional list of participants for them to review. Unfortunately, it's in PDF, so they just have to send the email back to me with whatever they want to have changed in their affiliation or address or telephone numbers or whatnot. So that's going to go out in a few minutes. And then we will also, this is for the trainers, maybe set up a meeting later this week to discuss which subjects we should revisit. And I would maybe take 5 minutes to ask participants today whether there are any subjects that they feel you know, were problematic or difficult to understand, or may warrant a second go at it. It can be now, it can be through email later, communicating with Thomas, so that for next week we can prepare a few smaller presentations on subjects that need further clarification or further detail. Thank you. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Bas, for that message to all of us and the participants. There is a request. Immediately, I sent the homework task from session 5. Professor Tim Carpenter is requesting that all participants should work on that. Task and submit it by close of business on Monday, so that they can also have time to look at it and be able to engage and interact adequately on Tuesday when we have the last session. So that is a message which was requested by Tim and the Noel and Tim Carpenter team to pass over to you participants. With that, I think, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of today's session. It was a very interactive session. It is good to participate in those homework tasks because it gives a feedback to the trainers. It also gives a feedback the way knowledge is being imparted to you, because you will know where we are getting to. You are supposed to come out to be able to do a risk assessment at the end of the training and to become an expert for your country where you come from, to better to advise, and whatever you come up with will assist and will inform on decision making for your country. I wanted to to ask let's, if you have a word to say before I go back to the team leader today, Noel. That's for you.
I mean, Thomas, who am I to say anything when I was missing for most of the session? Good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Good evening, speakers and trainers and participants. Immediately I logged in. I was stuck in another meeting until just an hour ago. But immediately I logged in, I looked at the number of people participating, and I realized that this meeting has consistently managed to get a participation of around 30, and it's usually the same people, same country, which is what training is all about. So I think this is coming out very nicely. And the training, sadly I missed my professor's presentation. I think I'll go back to Davis. He will do it for me specifically there.
Duly noted. Duly noted.
Okay. But I think, yeah, you realize that this is a very practical way of learning, and some of these things, I've been listening to the country presentations. You realize that this is doable. You can try it in your own countries, especially that African swine fever is ravaging everywhere in Africa. So this might be your way out of a solution to the farmers. So I hope we take this thing home and we really keep on trying. I know we're still in the middle of the training, but we take it home and keep on trying it. And when you get stuck, now you know the trainers, you know the experts. So I'm very excited about it, and I should stop talking forever. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
I see somebody who has never been with us from Ghana, Theophilus Odom. Can you just put on the mic and your camera so that you can say pass greetings to everybody?
Okay. Okay. I don't know whether you can see me well. Yep. So I am from Ghana, and unfortunately, this is my first time of participating because I've been very busy with other things, and I was told about this program recently, so I've not been able to join in. And I'm seeing everything. I'm hearing some of the presentations, interesting, and the exercises. Even though I'm a bit lost about it because I don't know what has happened before, but it looks interesting. Talking about ASF because it's something that we are dealing with it currently in our situation in Ghana. I am actually the head of the Accra Veterinary Laboratory. Formerly, it was my former boss, Dr. Joseph Awuni, if you have heard of his name. And he's on retirement, and I am now the head of the lab in Accra. So thank you.
Thank you. Then I want to pass over the baton to Noel to make the closing remarks. Over to you, Noel.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I guess of all the sessions to date, maybe this was the driest on import risk analysis. There's a lot of theory there, but hopefully we've provided you with a toolbox, some guidelines to assist in evaluating risk and the importance of actually being able to transparently document your rationale with the appropriate supporting evidence. There is a process there, and it is broadly applicable, I think, to not only to imports into a country, but it could also facilitate your ability to export by at least focusing on the entry assessment side of things. In previous iterations of the OIE framework, the entry assessment was referred to as the release assessment, which, when you think about it like that, maybe that's more relevant for exports. In other words, you can do some work to assure the sanitary safety of commodities that are exported from your country, whether they come from a compartment or whatever. But I think the discussion on compartmentalization to me is incredibly valuable. It really reflects an extremely valuable tool that's got a lot of application potentially. So good luck with the exercises. We'll see how everyone goes. And as I say, if you don't feel it's in, if you want to focus on maybe doing a risk assessment to support exports, that would be okay as well as looking at importing either into the country or into a compartment or trade within a country into the compartment, because that would help to map out the risk pathways that are relevant to assuring the sanitary safety of a particular compartment. So hopefully we can tease out some practical application of this somewhat dry subject of import risk analysis. To me, it's much more exciting to listen to the epidemiology of African swine fever and some of the diagnostic challenges and the practical application in terms of compartments. But anyway, good luck with the exercise, and we'll see you next week. Tim, did you want to say anything in closing? Okay, well, thank you everyone for your engagement today, and all the best in the following week, and look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all.